The book is a true story about four remarkable people who were caught up by decades of the scandal that is Ireland's Magdalene system. And it's a story about my dad and my mum, but not just about them, but about the secrets that they carried. And it was about how I came to recognise those secrets. I discovered my grandmother, his mum, and his dad, my grandfather. And it's the story about what happened to them. It's about my journey across Ireland, across the UK, to discover that secret or those secrets, and indeed the promises that some of them made to each other, and whether or not those promises and secrets have ever been reconciled.
Yeah, because it says, stretching across 14 years, a son seeks the truth. And that the promise to find truth and justice.
Sure.
Talk me through kind of the various stages of this.
I suppose growing up, it was a case of there were things that happened within the family. There were little hints or breadcrumbs or clues, which as a young person you kind of just bury away. And it was later on in life, in fact, it was when I was doing my law degree. Ironically, I did my dissertation in adoption, and it was within that I was learning about Ireland's different adoption systems. And it was within that discovery that I suddenly began to put the pieces together. And it culminated anyway in 2000 and the early part of 2001, where I was trying to persuade my dad to talk about his mom. He wouldn't do it, but he would acknowledge with simple yeses or nos to questions. But I made a promise to him, and I promised him that I would find his mum. And sadly, he died in 2001. And I reinstigated that promise. I refreshed that promise when I went to visit him before the church service. And you'll find in the book, it's a very deeply personal moment, just me and him. Reflection is in fact the first chapter, the promise. And it was around that promise that is what started my journey. And that journey didn't start until 9 years later, simply because, it's like everybody else. We have life to get on with, kids to bring up. But there was always a niggle with me that I hadn't started to keep the promise. And so in 2010, that's exactly what I did. Packed myself off on a flight to Ireland, and I went to the first place that I thought I should go, which was to the records office. They were on strike that day, would you believe it? But it was being managed by a number of managers. And what was interesting about that particular day was I wasn't the only English person in the records office seeking answers to a question mark over their family's past. And out of the 4 family units, I was the only one who came away with a birth certificate. And on that birth certificate, I discovered his mum's name. And that's how the journey started.
Wow. So it's been a bit of a journey of self-discovery for yourself, hasn't it, as well?
Gosh, yeah. I mean, it's... You begin, I've always realised growing up, and you'll see in the book that I talk about my early years and the early years of mum and dad. And I really began to understand that I've always been a child of two worlds. I'm English, but I'm also Irish. And as you grow up and you get older, you start to get into the workplace. Those kind of things get lost. But they're never forgotten. They're always there lurking. And this particular journey, as I said at the end of the book, I never imagined that it would bring me to look at my own identity, to understand my past, but to understand my belief systems, the belief systems of my dad. And, as people will discover, he came from a desperately terrible start in life. And, to understand, as I reflected as I was writing the book, understood his own innate actual recognition of what social justice was about was something that I had remembered but forgotten, but re-remembered in the kind of thing. So I'll give you for an example. He would always talk politics. Irish are very good at talking politics. And, there's no home that is immune from that at all. And he would talk about Ireland's sort of injustices of the past, and he would be very passionate about it. And he and I would have some very strong words about different aspects of it. But the one thing that he always used to say was that he always believed that people should be allowed to live as they wanted to live, and that they should always have enough food in their bellies, and that they should feel safe and secure. And this was a man who, up until I would say he was about 40, couldn't read or write. That was the kind of system, unfortunately, he was brought up in. And he existed. But for him to have that sort of social justice focus in his life without any kind of reading, but just understanding, because he was an Irish Gaelic speaker as well. It was kind of a rediscovery of my dad. As I say in the book, we learn more about our mums and dads after they've died, if we care to look for it. And that is definitely the case with him. But then, of course, I would never have known what his life was unless I'd studied to ask, because he certainly didn't volunteer details of his past, like many Magdalene women and Magdalene children.
Yeah, and I'm glad you've touched upon that then, because it's not just you writing about your mum and dad and your grandma. I mean, this is a real issue. A real issue that was to be explored and that people need to be aware of. Can you tell me about the issue that's at the heart of this?
Yeah, the issue at the heart of this was that my grandmother, Mary, and my grandfather were very sweet on each other. They had been for quite some time. And, I don't care whether it's 1930 or 2024, people get it together, as I often say. And that is exactly what happened. But there was a consequence in 1930s Ireland. And they tried to get married. They wanted to get married, but unfortunately, Mary's stepmom didn't give permission. There was no dowry. And so therefore, their great joy for life, their great passion, he was a musician and, she was very well educated. And there was a fear, an absolute fear of being denounced from the altar at the church. And as a result, she was carted off to the Loughrea county home. And she stayed there, from what I can understand, for several months before she went into labour, and she was then transferred to the Galway City Hospital. And she gave birth to my dad there at the end of September 1930. And for the first 10 days, and I know this will resonate with a lot of your women listeners, but for the first 10 days, it was mum and baby together. And then on the 10th day, they were both transported to the now infamous Tuam Mother and Baby Home. This is one of many mother and baby homes across Ireland who were operating as part of this Magdalene system. And when they entered the home, mum and dad were effectively separated. He was put into the nursery. She was put to hard labours. But they also, all the women had a joint responsibility for the nursery, and they were responsible for looking after to 6 children. But then usually a year after they entered any mother and baby home, some stayed longer, but usually it was the case that at the 12-month anniversary, they were put into a situation outside the home. So the separation, or the Irish word for separation, is scara. And I haven't been able to get to the bottom of this, but something happened in the 12-week period after her release from the Tuam Mother and Baby Home. And I can speculate where I think she may have ended up. But 12 weeks after they were separated, she was then transported from, whether it was Tuam or Ballinasloe, wherever, down to Dublin, to the second infamous institution, which was the High Park Magdalene Laundry in Dublin. And she stayed there for 42 years of her life until she died. And she worked in the laundry, and I now know that she became a seamstress within the laundry. As I discovered along the way, there were many aspects about Mary's life in the laundry, but one thing is absolutely certain. is from people who I've met here who live in the UK who knew Mary. She never forgot her son. She never forgot her partner.
So she was moved to these homes, but she didn't get to take her baby with her?
No, absolutely not. No, they were together in a kind of a separated way, the children, mother and baby home. But by the time that 12-week period at the end of year one, when she was transported down to the laundry, that was it. There was no connection. There was no information given to her, or indeed her partner, my grandfather. He knew he had a son in order to receive that assistance, because otherwise they'd have been thrown onto the streets to fend for themselves. She had to sign a statement to identify who the father was. Now, many women didn't do that, but they received the assistance nonetheless. Mary did provide that brief statement, and Patrick appeared before the Portumna District Court on the 14th of April 1931, and he had representation for himself, and he happily accepted that he was the father of my dad, and he took the consequences. He was ordered to pay so much for the upkeep of his son. And that was an interesting point, because on the flip side of the coin, when the women were released from the mother and baby homes, they too had to contribute to their children's care. And as a postscript to the general way of things, my dad was in the children, mother and baby home for the first 5 years of his life. Just before his 5th birthday, he became desperately ill with anemia. He was a very poorly little boy, and they quickly moved him out into what they call a boarded out. Modern day parlance is fostering, but he moved out to a boarded out system. Many of the boys and girls who were moved out to boarding out were terribly abused. Happily, in my dad's case, that wasn't it. But he stayed with that family until he was in his 20s before he came to the UK.
Just one final question for you, because I'm quite fascinated about the fact that your grandmother left and was in at home, but yet if baby had been adopted, then why was she not allowed to resume her normal life, so to speak?
Well, the authorities and the church will tell you that many of the women were allowed to go back to their families, allowed the families to reclaim them, and so on and so forth. And that isn't the case. Many of them were held for many years within the laundries. It was a system in Ireland which was, you had committed. They were criminalised without any due process by the laws at the time. They were known as offenders and inmates. And so therefore, Ireland at the time, particularly in 1930, right up until 1989, was heavily reliant on the social system to deliver the social system through the religious institutions. And church and state, certainly up until the late 1980s, remained very, very tied and close. And so therefore, these were not desirable characters to have in what was constructed as a Catholic state in 1922. And there's a whole heck of a history about church politics from the late 1890s right up to Ireland's independence, which severely had a tremendous influence on the formation of the Irish state and political thinking. And unfortunately, by 1930, my grandmother Mary and Patrick, they did not stand a chance. Not a chance at all. And as a result of what happened, whatever about Mary, Patrick, as I say, knew he had a child. He knew and was still remained in love with his partner Mary, but he never had another relationship and remained in solitude for the rest of his life. The community around him effectively ostracised him. He lived a very lonely life.
It really is. The whole thing is kind of scandalous, heartbreaking. There's so much to what you've written. And I think what people are thinking now when they're listening is, how can I read it?
Well, you can go to any bookstore and you can ask for a Magdalene Rose. You can buy it directly from me, which is through my online shop, which is frankbreheny.shop. And I shall be opening up different portals through Booksby and Ingram Spark, where people anywhere in the world, you can get hold of the book. And that will happen from the 19th of May onwards.
And you also having a big book launch. Where will that be, please?
Yes, that's going to be in Monmouth. And it was interesting why I chose there, because South Wales had 23 mother and baby homes, and 55,000 women and children passed through those doors, and the UK is still struggling with that aspect. So all the victims and survivors are, certainly. But I'm looking forward to bringing this book to the fore on the 17th, and it is the start of what I call the final chapter. It's called The Journey Home, and this is the beginning of the Journey Home tour.